There are stories that cling to you like shadows that stretch long after the sun sets. Growing up, I had always been a skeptic. Ghost stories, folklore, and urban legends were fun campfire tales, but nothing more than exaggerated fears or imagination running wild. At least that's what I believed, until I encountered the truth behind the legend of La Llorona, the weeping woman. This story isn't one I share lightly. Even now, as I sit to recount the events, the memories send shivers down my spine, and the air around me feels heavier. But it's a tale that needs to be told, a warning to anyone foolish enough to dismiss the cries in the night. It began with an unexpected trip. My friend Miguel had inherited a small, weathered house from his grandmother in a remote village in Mexico. She had passed away a few months earlier, and the property was his to manage. Miguel asked me to accompany him to help settle some paperwork and do minor repairs before he decided what to do with the place. I thought it would be a nice break, a chance to disconnect from the chaos of city life. The house sat on the edge of the village, where the roads turned to dirt and the land rolled into thick, silent forests. When we arrived, the first thing I noticed was how eerily quiet the area was. No children playing, no dogs barking, just the occasional whisper of the wind through the trees. Miguel didn't seem to notice, but something about the air made me uneasy. The house itself was a modest adobe structure with a sagging roof and faded blue shutters. Despite its condition, it had a certain charm, though that charm quickly dissipated when we stepped inside. The smell of mildew hung in the air, and the walls seemed to hold a lingering sadness, as if they had absorbed decades of sorrow. After unpacking and tidying up the place, we decided to visit a small cantina in the village for dinner. The locals were friendly enough, but their smiles faltered when Miguel mentioned the house. One elderly woman gripped her rosary tightly and muttered something under her breath. Another man warned us not to stay out too late, his tone far more serious than the situation warranted. When we pressed them for details, they exchanged uneasy glances and told us to respect the nights and avoid the riverbank. Curiosity got the better of me, and I asked if the warnings had anything to do with La Llorona. The mere mention of her name seemed to darken the room. A young bartender leaned in and whispered, "She wanders near your house. Don't answer her cries, no matter what you hear." We laughed nervously on the way back, chalking it up to local superstition. But as the night wore on, the laughter faded. Around midnight, I awoke to the sound of crying. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a distant sound carried by the wind. But as I sat up in bed, the noise became clearer, a woman's mournful wail, rising and falling like a broken song. My first thought was that someone outside needed help. I nudged Miguel awake, but he groggily dismissed me, mumbling something about stray animals before falling back asleep. Unable to ignore the cries, I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The night was oppressively dark, and the beam of light barely cut through the inky blackness. The cries seemed to be coming from the direction of the river, just as the villagers had warned. As I approached the riverbank, the air grew colder. The sound of rushing water filled my ears, mingling with the sobbing that seemed to echo all around me. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Is someone there?" The crying stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. My heart pounded in my chest as I scanned the area with my flashlight. That's when I saw her. She stood on the opposite bank of the river, her back turned to me. Her long black hair cascaded down her back, and she wore a tattered white dress that seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight. At first, relief washed over me. I wasn't imagining things, but that relief quickly turned to dread. She turned slowly and my flashlight flickered. Her face was obscured in shadow, but her eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the dark. She raised her hand, pointing directly at me, and let out a bone-chilling scream that echoed through the trees. My legs felt like lead, but instinct took over, and I ran back to the house as fast as I could. Miguel was waiting at the door, his face pale. "You heard her, didn't you?" he whispered. I nodded, too shaken to speak. He slammed the door shut and locked it, muttering prayers under his breath. The following days were a blur of sleepless nights and unexplainable events. Doors slammed on their own, objects moved without explanation, and the sound of crying persisted, sometimes closer, sometimes farther. Miguel admitted that his grandmother had often spoken of La Llorona, warning the family to stay away from the river at night. He hadn't taken her seriously, but now he wasn't so sure. One night, as we sat huddled in the living room, the crying grew louder. It was coming from just outside the window. Miguel grabbed a knife from the kitchen, while I held a wooden chair leg, my makeshift weapon. The sobbing turned to laughter, soft at first, then rising to a maniacal cackle. The lights flickered, and for a brief moment, her face appeared in the window. It was grotesque, her skin pale and stretched tightly over her skull, her mouth unnaturally wide as if screaming, and her eyes hollow and black. She vanished as quickly as she appeared, leaving us in stunned silence. Desperate for answers, we sought out the village elder, a woman named Doña Elena. She told us the story of La Llorona, a woman who had drowned her own children in a fit of rage and was cursed to wander the earth, searching for them. According to legend, she preyed on those who strayed too close to water at night, luring them to their doom. Doña Elena also revealed that Miguel's grandmother had tried to ward off the spirit by placing protective symbols around the property, but over time they had faded or been removed. She gave us a small pouch filled with herbs and told us to burn it while reciting a prayer. That night, armed with the pouch and Doña Elena's instructions, we prepared ourselves for what felt like a final confrontation. The crying began as expected, but this time it was accompanied by whispers, soft, insidious words that crept into our minds. We lit the herbs and began the prayer, our voices trembling. The room grew colder, and a shadow materialized in the corner. It was her. She floated towards us, her feet barely touching the ground, her face contorted in rage. The smell of stagnant water filled the air as she let out another ear-piercing scream. The fire flared brightly and she recoiled, her form flickering like a dying flame. With one final guttural wail she vanished, leaving us in darkness. The house felt different after that night, lighter, almost peaceful. We left the village the next day, vowing never to return. But the memory of La Llorona lingers. Her cries still echo in my mind, a chilling reminder of the curse that haunts the land. If you ever hear a woman weeping in the night, do yourself a favor. Don't look, don't answer, and whatever you do, stay away from the water. The following days in Miguel's inherited house blurred into a surreal nightmare. The events of the first night had shaken both of us to the core. Miguel had tried to put on a brave face, assuring me it was just an overactive imagination combined with the eerie isolation of the village. But his words rang hollow. We both knew we were dealing with something far beyond rational explanation. By now, the atmosphere in the house had changed. The air felt heavy, and a sense of unease hung over everything. Even the faintest creak of the old wooden floor or rustle of wind outside was enough to put us on edge. But nothing could prepare us for what was to come. 2 nights after my encounter at the river, I awoke to the unmistakable sensation of being watched. My eyes snapped open, and for a moment I couldn't move. The room was pitch black, but I could feel something in the corner. Slowly I reached for my phone to turn on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the old, cracked walls of the room. I exhaled a shaky breath and tried to convince myself it was just paranoia. But as I lay back down, I heard it again, the crying. This time, it wasn't coming from the river. It was inside the house. The sobs echoed faintly through the walls, growing louder with each passing second. I bolted upright, my heart racing. Miguel burst into my room, his face pale. "You hear it too?" he whispered. I nodded, too terrified to speak. Together we crept toward the living room, clutching makeshift weapons, Miguel with his grandmother's rusted machete and me with a heavy candlestick. The crying seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It was a mournful, gut-wrenching wail that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. As we entered the living room, the crying stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence. The air felt colder, and the faint scent of stagnant water wafted through the room. Suddenly, the door to the backyard creaked open on its own, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. The next morning, we decided to investigate the property in daylight. Something had to explain the eerie occurrences, some logical reason for why we were hearing things and feeling watched. As we walked around the house, Miguel stopped abruptly, pointing to the ground near the back door. There, etched into the dirt, were strange symbols. They looked like ancient markings, hastily scratched into the earth. Miguel's face darkened. "My grandmother used to carve symbols like this into the ground," he said. "She said they were to keep spirits away." "But these don't look protective," I said, kneeling to inspect them. The lines were jagged and uneven, as if made in a frenzy. Whoever, or whatever, had created them hadn't meant to protect. They were a call, an invitation. Desperate for answers, we returned to Doña Elena, the village elder. She welcomed us into her modest home, her wise eyes scanning our faces with concern. After we described the symbols and the crying, she crossed herself and muttered a prayer. "La Llorona's curse is strongest near water," she said gravely. "But her influence spreads where the veil between worlds is thin. Your house, it's close to the river, yes? And it holds sorrow. Such places attract her." Miguel explained that his grandmother had always believed in spirits but rarely spoke of them. "She used to leave offerings at the river," he said. "Flowers, candles, sometimes food. I thought it was just a tradition." Doña Elena nodded. It was, a tradition meant to appease her. Armed with Doña Elena's advice, we returned to the house and prepared offerings for the river: white roses, candles, and a small bowl of rice. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, we ventured to the riverbank to leave the gifts. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet, the usual hum of insects and birds replaced by an eerie stillness. We placed the offerings near the water's edge and lit the candles, reciting the prayer Doña Elena had taught us. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, just as we began to relax, the temperature plummeted. The candles flickered violently before extinguishing themselves, plunging us into darkness. A low, guttural wail rose from the river, growing louder and more piercing. The surface of the water began to ripple, though no wind blew. And then we saw her. La Llorona emerged from the shadows, her white dress tattered and soaked, her hair matted against her skeletal face. Her eyes glowed faintly, and her mouth stretched wide in an unnatural scream. She reached out toward us, her bony fingers clawing at the air. Miguel and I stumbled back, our instincts screaming at us to run. But my foot caught on a root, and I fell hard. As I scrambled to get up, she floated closer, her anguished cries filling my ears. Just as she was within reach, Miguel threw a handful of salt from the pouch Doña Elena had given us. The spirit recoiled, shrieking in rage, before vanishing into the night. We fled back to the house, slamming the door behind us and locking every window. The crying persisted throughout the night, but La Llorona never appeared again. Exhausted and terrified, we decided to leave the village the next morning. But the terror didn't end there. As we packed our belongings, Miguel found something chilling: a single white rose lying on his bed, its petals soaked in water. "Do you think this is a warning?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think it's a reminder," I said, my throat dry. "She's not bound to the river. She can follow." We left the house and the village behind, but the memories linger. To this day, I can't hear the sound of crying without feeling a chill run down my spine. Miguel and I don't talk about what happened, there's nothing more to say. But if you ever hear a woman's sobs in the night, take my advice. Don't investigate, don't follow the sound, and above all, never ever go to the water. La Llorona is real, and she's still searching. Leaving the village behind was supposed to bring peace, but we soon realized that La Llorona's curse wasn't tied to the river, it was tied to us. The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and constant dread. No matter where Miguel and I went, the faint sound of crying seemed to follow, growing louder when we were alone or in the dead of night. It became clear that we needed help, and fast. But help would come at a cost neither of us could have imagined. After leaving the village, Miguel and I stayed at a small motel on the outskirts of a bustling city. We thought the noise and crowds would keep the spirit at bay, but we were wrong. On the first night, I woke to find the room ice cold despite the humid summer weather. The crying was there again, faint and distant at first, but growing closer by the second. I turned on the bedside lamp, expecting to see Miguel still asleep. Instead, his bed was empty, the covers tossed aside. Panic gripped me as I called his name, my voice trembling. Then, from the bathroom, I heard a low, guttural sobbing. Heart pounding, I crept toward the door, calling out to him again. "Miguel, are you okay?" The sobbing stopped. I pushed the door open, and my blood ran cold. The mirror above the sink was fogged up, and on its surface, written in dripping water, were the words, "Mis hijos, ¿dónde están?" My children, where are they? Miguel was standing in front of the sink, his eyes wide with terror. "She's here," he whispered. "She's not going to stop." The next day, we sought the advice of a shaman known for his ability to break curses and commune with spirits. He lived deep in the countryside, a man of few words but profound wisdom. When we arrived, he listened intently to our story, his expression growing darker with each passing detail. "La Llorona is not just a ghost," he explained. "She is a force of grief and vengeance, drawn to those who have suffered loss, or those who bear guilt." "But we haven't done anything," I protested. The shaman's piercing gaze met mine. "Not all guilt is conscious," he said. "Sometimes it is inherited. A debt passed down through generations. Perhaps your families are tied to her tragedy, or perhaps she simply sees something in you that reminds her of her pain." Miguel asked the question we both dreaded. "Can she be stopped?" The shaman sighed. "Stopping her is impossible, but you can banish her from your lives, at least temporarily. It will require a ritual, but be warned. Confronting her comes with risks. If you falter, she will claim you." That evening, the shaman prepared a sacred space on the edge of a forest, far from any water. Candles encircled us, their flames flickering in the wind. He placed offerings in the center, flowers, incense, and a small doll that he said represented the children La Llorona mourned. The shaman instructed us to sit within the circle and repeat a prayer, while he chanted in a language neither of us understood. The air grew heavy, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. Then she appeared. La Llorona emerged from the shadows, her figure translucent yet terrifyingly real. Her sobs echoed through the night, each one piercing my soul. Her hollow eyes locked onto mine, and I felt an overwhelming wave of despair. It was as if her grief was being poured directly into me, suffocating and unrelenting. "Do not look at her," the shaman shouted. "Focus on the prayer." Miguel and I chanted desperately, our voices trembling. The shaman sprinkled a powder into the air, and the flames of the candles roared to life, forming a barrier between us and the spirit. But La Llorona was relentless. She clawed at the barrier, her wails turning into furious screams. The ground beneath us shook, and the air filled with the smell of stagnant water. "Hold steady," the shaman yelled. "She's trying to break through." As the ritual reached its climax, the shaman threw a final handful of powder into the flames. A blinding light erupted from the circle, and for a moment everything went silent. When the light faded, La Llorona was gone. The oppressive weight lifted, and the air felt lighter. Miguel and I collapsed to the ground, exhausted but relieved. "It is done," the shaman said. "She will not trouble you again if you stay away from the water and respect her memory." Miguel and I returned to the city, determined to rebuild our lives. The crying ceased, and the oppressive feeling of being watched disappeared. But the experience left scars on our minds, our hearts, and our souls. I still have nightmares about her, waking up in a cold sweat with her anguished face burned into my memory. Miguel rarely talks about what happened, but I know he feels the same lingering dread. We've both vowed never to return to that village or go near the river. And every year, on the anniversary of that night, I light a candle and leave flowers by a stream near my home. It's not an offering, just a reminder to myself of the power of grief, the weight of guilt, and the thin line between the living and the dead. If you ever hear crying in the night, do not investigate. If you see a woman in white by the water, do not approach her. La Llorona is real, and she is always watching, always waiting. And she will never stop searching. Thank you for listening to my story. If you want to hear more scary stories, please like and subscribe to my channel.